Hi everybody, it's Mrs. Tucker again. Today we're going to read through the second half of our story, Helen Keller. I'll do a quick review at the beginning so that you can remember what we read about yesterday. And then at the end of today's lesson, I want you to email to your teacher the answer to this question: how can you communicate in different ways? I want you to think about different ways that you can communicate with people. How can you do that? And then I want you to email your teacher the answer to that question. Okay, remember, this is a biography, so it's a story that's talking about a person's life. It's an informational story, just like an informational text. But what makes it different is it's a story about a person's life. So we're going to see some photographs in this story. It's going to be full of information about just Helen Keller and the people that were important in her life, as well as some things that happened, some events that happened in her life. And remember, those events, those important things, we're going to learn about in order. So yesterday when we were talking about Helen Keller, we started out reading the story, and the author was describing how Helen was touching something warm and coarse and smooth and wet, and then all of a sudden, slap, a hairy tail smacked into Helen's face. And we talked about that the reason why the author started the story this way was, first of all, it probably got your attention. It grabbed your attention, made you interested in the story. Also, we talked about the reason why the author started the story this way is because she wants you to understand what it was like for Helen being blind. She wants you to kind of get a feeling of what it was like to not be able to see the cow, but still feeling the cow, trying to figure out what was going on. Now, remember when Helen was born in 1880 in Tuscumbia, Alabama, she was born being able to see and being able to hear. But then when she was a baby, she became very, very sick. And that illness that she had, remember, illness means to be sick, not healthy. That illness that she had took away her ability to see and her ability to hear. So she became blind and deaf after she had an illness or after she got sick. And then after that, she couldn't hear or see anything. And it said there was only silence, which means no sound, and darkness, which meant no light. So all she had in her life was no sound and no light. Remember, we talked about how if you want to learn words when you're young and you're a baby, you hear the words in order to be able to learn the words, but she couldn't hear anything, so she couldn't say anything. So instead, she would make motions with her hands. A motion, remember, is an action or a movement. So she would motion for her mother by touching her face. When she wanted her dad, she would pretend to put on a pair of glasses. When she was hungry, she would pretend that she was cutting bread and putting butter on it. And that Helen knew she was different from the rest of her family. She could tell that they could talk. She would hold her hands up on their mouths and feel their lips move, and then she would try to move her lips the same way, but nobody could understand her. And remember, when nobody could understand her, she became super angry and frustrated. She would get really upset, and she would scream and cry and kick for hours, and she would throw things and she would hit people. But it didn't make any difference because she was still alone. She couldn't hear anything. She still couldn't see anything. And it became hard for her parents to control her, and they didn't know what to do, so they took her to lots of doctors, and none of those doctors knew what to do. But then one day, when she was 6 years old, a doctor said they should go see Dr. Alexander Graham Bell. Remember, what made him a little bit different was that he wasn't really a medical doctor. He was a doctor who invented things. He had invented the telephone, and he also taught deaf people. And then Dr. Bell told them to write a letter to Michael Anagus in Boston. He was the head, which means kind of like the principal of the Perkins Institution for the Blind. And that Dr. Bell thought that Helen could learn how to let out her thoughts that were inside of her. And Mr. Anagus promised that he would send Helen a teacher. So today that's where we're going to start our story. We're going to talk about Helen and her teacher. And then we're going to finish through the rest of the questions and going over the vocabulary that's in our story. So at the top of the page we have our heading, Helen and Teacher, March 1887. So now Helen's 7 years old. Helen's teacher came to live with the Kellers that spring. Her name was Annie Sullivan. Annie had studied at the Perkins School. She was nearly blind herself. Annie needed to control Helen's wild behavior so she could teach her. But Helen did not understand that Annie wanted to help her. For 2 weeks, Helen fought with Annie. She hit Annie and knocked out one of her front teeth. She even locked Annie in an upstairs room. Mr. Keller had to get a ladder and let Annie out through a window. Now, also, too, remember we talked yesterday about how we don't see a lot of real photographs in this story because in the time that this story was written, or the time that this story happened, was in the 1800s. And in the 1800s, people didn't really use cameras for photographs as often as we would use a camera. Plus, the camera or the pictures are all black and white because they really didn't have color for their photographs then either. So here's a real photograph of Annie Sullivan. Now, before I turn the page, I want you to think about Helen's wild behavior. And if you want to pause for a second after I ask you the rest of this question, you can pause and think about it before you go on. What are 2 examples of Helen's wild behavior towards Annie Sullivan? What are some things, 2 examples of things that Helen did to her teacher, Annie Sullivan? Well, it says right here, one of the things was that she hit Annie and knocked out one of her front teeth. And it says she even locked Annie in an upstairs room. So think about this next, and if you want to pause, you can. According to our story, why did Helen act like this? Well, let's think about that a little bit. Why would Helen act like this? Well, first of all, Helen cannot see or hear. So how is she going to understand that this new person that has come into her life, Annie Sullivan, is there to help her? Her mom and dad can tell her, but she can't hear them. She doesn't have any way of communicating. So how is she going to understand that Helen is there, or that Annie is there to help her? Helen doesn't understand that Annie's there to help her. So that might be one reason why Helen acted that way. She didn't understand that Annie was there to be her teacher, to be a helper. Why else might Helen have acted that way? Think about that for a second. Why else did Helen act the way she did? Well, it said back on the other page that Helen was very frustrated. It made her angry. See, that made Helen angry. So Helen's angry. She's very frustrated. She's very upset. And she probably didn't really meet new people very often. She can't hear or see them. So even if somebody came to visit the house that she had never met before, she probably didn't even know they were there. So she's probably maybe even a little scared because this new person is suddenly in her house that she doesn't recognize in any way. Still, Annie did not give up. Little by little, Helen learned to trust her new teacher. Annie began to teach Helen about words. She spelled words using her fingers. Her hand formed a different shape for each letter. She pressed each shape into Helen's hand. When she gave Helen some cake, she spelled C-A-K-E into Helen's palm. When Helen held her doll, Annie spelled D-O-L-L for Helen. She imitated the shapes. She thought it was a game. She didn't know that the shapes spelled words. After a month, Helen could spell whatever Annie spelled. But Helen still did not know that she was naming the things she touched. And here's a photograph caption. It says Annie finger spelling into Helen's hand. So you can see how Helen has her hand over top of Annie's hand, and Annie is probably spelling the letters of a word. Now here's a vocabulary word, imitated. Imitated means copied. So Helen would copy what Annie would do. Now let's think about Helen's teacher, Annie, a little bit. Annie Sullivan, Helen's teacher, was almost blind herself. So Annie could hear, but she could not see very well. She was almost blind. How do you think this helped Annie to be a better teacher for Helen? Well, thinking that Annie probably understood what it was like for Helen not to be able to see. So it could help her understand better what it was like not to see, as well as she probably had some ways or ideas of how she could teach Helen better because she already knew what it was like not to be able to see. So she could help Helen in a way that somebody else who could see couldn't help her. So let's think about what are some words that we could use to describe Annie Sullivan. What kind of person is Annie Sullivan? If you want to pause for a second to think about it, you can. How can we describe Annie Sullivan? Well, I think Annie Sullivan was probably very understanding. She knew what it was like to be blind. I imagine she was very, very patient. Even when Helen hit her and locked her in a room, she still stuck around. She sounds like she's kind of tough, too. She stuck around after somebody hit her hard enough to knock a tooth out. Probably pretty forgiving, even though Helen was not treating her very nicely. She didn't hold that against Helen. She still stuck around and tried to help her. And I imagine Annie Sullivan was also pretty smart. She had some ideas that nobody else could tell her, that nobody else could use with Helen. Now, on the next page, it says, one day Helen and Annie walked to the well house. Someone was pumping water. Annie pushed Helen's hand into the rushing water. Helen felt the cool water on one hand. She felt her teacher's fingers spelling W-A-T-E-R into her other hand. Over and over, Annie spelled the word. Suddenly, Helen stood very still. All at once, she understood. The liquid flowing over her hand had a name. It was W-A-T-E-R. Everything had a name. Helen wanted to learn them all. She ran from one thing to another. Annie spelled the name of everything Helen touched. Then Helen turned and pointed to Annie. T-E-A-C-H-E-R spelled Annie. From then on, Helen's name for Annie was teacher. That summer, Helen learned a lot of new words. She stopped using her old motions. Her fingers gave her all the words she needed. Now, before I go on to the next page, let's talk about the sequence of events that happened at the well house. Now, remember, everything happens in a sequence. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. So let's talk about the sequence of the events of the things that happened in the well house here. Let me zoom out a little bit. So, what happened first in this picture? Well, the first thing was that Annie pushed Helen's hand into the water. So, first Annie pushed Helen's hand into the water, and then Helen felt the water. Next, while Helen's hand is in the water and she's feeling it, Annie is spelling the word W-A-T-E-R. So she's doing that in Helen's hand over and over and over again, the hand that's not in the water. So Helen can feel the water with one hand. She can feel Annie spell W-A-T-E-R in her other hand over and over. And then finally, Helen understood that those letters that Annie was putting into her hands meant the thing she was touching, water. That's quite an amazing sequence of events if you think about it. Now, what do you think was the most important thing that happened because of this experience at the water pump? You can pause and think about that for a second if you want to. What do you think is the most important thing that happened because of this experience at the water pump? Well, I think the most important thing was that Helen learned how to communicate with words. Remember before this, Helen could not communicate. She just used motions or actions. She moved her hands. She couldn't communicate any other way. Nobody really understood her. Now, all of a sudden, she can communicate using words. And let's find the details in the story that help us understand this. So some of the details in the story it says that It says, let me find it here. Annie spelled the name of everything Helen touched. And then Annie turned, whoops, that's not what I'm looking for. Oh, it said that she understood that Helen understood that everything suddenly had a name. When Helen turned and pointed to Annie, and Annie spelled Teacher, from then on, Helen understood that Annie was teacher. And she would run from one thing to another thing, and Annie would spell the name of everything that Annie stood. All at once she understood that Annie was spelling words of things that she was touching. So suddenly she understood that there were words for these things, and she didn't have to use the motions anymore. Sorry, I got a little stuck with that answer there. Now, before I go on, I want to talk about this real quick. This is our analyzing the text. We're talking about a biography, and how was learning all the things that have a name an important event in Helen's life? Well, we just talked about that a little bit. If it's an important event in her life, because before this she did not know how to talk at all. And suddenly, this is an important event because she suddenly learned how she could communicate. She suddenly learned how to speak with words. Okay, going on to the next page, it says, Annie did not teach Helen words one at a time. She talked to her in full sentences. That way, Helen learned more than just new words. She learned new ideas. Helen and Annie took long walks through the woods and along the river. Annie gave Helen lessons on the walks. She showed Helen how seeds sprout and plants grow. She made mountains out of mud and taught Helen about volcanoes. Sometimes they climbed a tree and had a lesson there. And here is an illustration. This is a drawing, but it still has a caption. It says Helen and Annie having a lesson. So here they are having a lesson in the tree. So let's look at this picture. If we didn't have this caption, if I took the caption away and you were just looking at the picture, what do you think might be happening in that picture? Well, it looks like there's two people sitting in a tree, Annie and Helen, and they're reading a book. So how does this caption help you? Well, we've already talked about captions as an important text feature in our story. And we already know that captions help us better understand what's going on in the pictures. Pictures don't have words. Sometimes we need some words to better explain them. Helen was hungry for knowledge. She wanted to learn everything Annie could teach her. Soon Annie started teaching Helen how to read. The words were printed in raised letters for a blind person. Helen felt the words with her fingers. She liked to hunt for words she knew. When she learned to read better, she read her books over and over. Her curious fingers wore down the raised letters. Knowledge was one of our vocabulary words. Knowledge is when you have information and facts about something. You already know information and facts about something. And curious is another one of our vocabulary words. When you're curious, it means you're really interested in learning about something. Whether it's something you already know, you want to learn more about it, or something that you want to learn that's new to you. So let me ask this question. How do we know that Helen read her books many times? If you want to pause and think about that, you can. How do we know that Helen read her books many times? Well, the author tells us, when she learned to read better, she read her books over and over. Her curious fingers wore down the raised letters. Now, here is a picture, looks like a photograph, of reading a book in Braille. And I'm going to try to zoom in a little bit so you can see the photograph better. It's kind of hard to see, I know. But what we have right here on the page is actually dots that are raised. So when you read a book in Braille, when a book is written in Braille, it's not words like we have on our page. It's a bunch of dots. Now, you've probably seen this in our school. If you notice the signs that are outside everybody's classroom that has the room number, and then underneath it, there's some dots. It tells you what room it is in words and numbers on the sign, but the dots also tell you in Braille what that room is. So if you've ever taken the time to feel those, then you are familiar with what Braille feels like. It's just a bunch of raised dots. So when she's reading her books over and over, she's rubbing her fingers along these dots. And she's rubbed her fingers on those dots so many times that the dots have worn down so that they aren't as raised as they used to. Now, why do you think the author is showing us that Helen is doing this? How do you think Helen feels about learning? Well, I think she probably is really interested in learning. She wanted to learn because it's saying she liked to hunt for words she knew. She'd read her books over and over and over, so much that her fingers wore down the letters. So she's really interested and really curious about learning. On the final page it says, Helen also learned to write. She wrote letters to her family and Dr. Bell. She wrote many letters to Mr. Anagus in Boston. Mr. Anagus was amazed by how much Helen had learned. He published some of Helen's letters. Reporters began to write about Helen. Soon she was famous. People all over the world wanted to know about the miracle girl. And Helen wanted to know all about the world. Now I noticed here in the story they called her the miracle girl. Why do you think people called her the miracle girl? If you need to pause and think about it, go ahead. Well, I think one of the reasons why they called her the miracle girl is because Helen she could not hear, she could not see. But she learned to read, and she learned to write, and she was able to learn about the world. So even though she could hear nothing, she could see nothing, she still learned a lot of stuff. And she was able to write things. She was able to write letters. She was able to communicate with people. So she really, really, really was quite a miracle. And were people right to admire Helen? When you admire somebody, that means that you are really amazed at what she could do. So do you think people were right to be amazed, to admire her? Well, yes, I think so. Don't you think? And why do you think so? Well, it says that she was famous. So she was exceptional. They had the right to admire her. She was really amazing because she could do some things better than people who had all of their senses. She could do some things better than people who could hear and see and have all the other senses too. So even though she was blind and deaf, she overcame those obstacles and she became really amazing, was able to do a lot of things just like everybody else could. Well, I thank you for listening to this story, for listening to the second half. And remember, with all of our stories, you can go back if you want to, and you can listen to them again. So if you are interested in the Helen Keller story, you can learn more about it again. Now, what I want you to do now, before you are done for the day, is you're going to need a paper and a pencil or a pen. And I want you to write down on a piece of paper, how can you communicate in different ways? I want you to write your answer to that question. How can you communicate in different ways? And I want you to send a picture of that answer to your teacher. All right, thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye.